Hello, thank you for joining us for this session. The session is called Stress and Loneliness, Maintaining Mental Health in the City. I'm Untitled Chapter. I'm director of the Center for Conscious Design, which is an international think tank looking at improving the city, and also HUME and the Human Metrics Lab and Architecture and Urban Design Practice Informed by Science. First of all, I want to thank Moscow Urban Forum for inviting us and hosting us, and congratulations for putting together such an interesting program in a very challenging time. So thank you for that. Just some opening remarks from me before we go to our speakers. The World Health Organization defines mental health as a state of well-being in which each person is aware of his potential, can cope with ordinary life stress, can work productively, and is able to contribute to his community or her community. This definition is relevant for issues of urban health-oriented development. It also reflects the key components of a sustainable environment and city life. Mental illness includes a wide range of conditions that cause changes in people's thinking, emotions, and behavior, and even the way the brain is wired. In the urban environment, the risk of an increase in spread of affective disorders is 30% higher than in suburbs and rural areas. Cities increase the risk and occurrence of anxiety, and also the risk of occurrence of schizophrenia. I'll add some more context in a bit, but first of all, it's my pleasure to introduce our distinguished speakers: Moshe Bar, Head of Cognitive Neuroscience Lab at Bar-Ilan University; Robin Hewins, Director of Campaign Policy and Research at Campaign to End Loneliness in the UK; Alexei Danilov, Director of Interdisciplinary Medicine Institute, Chief of the Department of Neurology at Sechenov University; and Olga Katiana, if I said that right, CEO of Alta. So as you can see, we have a rich variety of perspectives, and we'll be hearing about each of those, prompting us to think about how we can build our cities to bring about better social health and therefore better mental health. Each speaker will be speaking for around 7 minutes, and then we'll have about 3 minutes where I'll ask more questions to ground these ideas in how we can improve the built environment. So with that, I will just share a presentation of mine for some comments. If you just hold on. Okay. So first of all, just to point out that there are many different ways to tackle loneliness and improve mental health. However, in this conference, we're speaking about the role of the urban environment. There are many theories also about the rise of loneliness, a lot around the role of technology, but it would be naive to think that the environments that we create don't play a major role in how our society develops. We shouldn't ignore the huge opportunity that the city offers in alleviating and preventing such issues. We code our social values into the built environment, and these values, these rules of engagement, shape our everyday lives. And for the sake of this discussion, also shape how we connect with others and ourselves. To understand the mental health effects of the pandemic, we need to look at the city as a medium for connection, one that connects people, but also one that enables each of us to connect to aspects of ourselves that emerge in different contexts. Healthy personal interactions, many of which preserve or develop parts of our identity, are crucial for social well-being, for child development, and even for the slowing down of cognitive decline in older adults. The city is a player in these interactions through the different settings it provides, enriching experiences and grounding their memory in place. Design offers behavioral cues that either hinder or support healthy interactions. Place is an active part in the nature of our interactions, and the quality of place will also affect the quality of the connections we create and maintain. During the pandemic, we all have experienced significant disconnection from our network and parts of our own identities. It's not that the pandemic created this effect alone. It's a combination of its effects and the lack of shared spaces to meet safely outdoors. What can we learn from this experience? For me, the post-pandemic city can become a healthier place only if we reshuffle its priorities. We need to rebuild the city to become a better medium for connection at all times, including a pandemic. And that means repurposing public places around genuine, meaningful, and safe interactions. But the modeling of how people are connected in the city is currently done in a way that flattens the effort to talk about quality. How accessible is our social network? And here I want to point out that there's a difference between accessibility and mobility. The latter gets more attention in this field because the former takes more thinking and investment to create, but is more sustainable in the long run. What are the quality of the places that we share? And do we have agency in these places to adapt them to our social needs? We have to ask ourselves, what is the responsibility of public-facing design? Can we rethink the hostility that many environments project that stop us from dwelling and sharing experiences with others and push us back into our homes for lack of comfort and agency? How can we rewrite the urban social contract and create places to be and places to be together? We'll now dive into the talks from our speakers and think together about the implications of their insights. It's my pleasure to first of all introduce Professor Moshe Bar, who really from my personal journey was the very first scientist who gave me insights and ideas and discussions about how we can integrate science into design. And we co-wrote the Conscious Cities Manifesto together. And from there on, I'm still admiring his work. So I'm very excited to hear from Moshe Bar. Welcome. I think you just need to unmute.
Okay. Hello, everybody. Thank you for inviting me and thank you for this kind introduction. So I'm a cognitive neuroscientist. I study the brain. And the first thing I would like to say, since we're talking here about mental illness, is that I know that the vast majority of the population think about mental illness, psychiatric disorders, as either an issue of chemicals in the brain or some mysterious component that's far from most of us who don't suffer from mental illness directly. And what I would like to promote here today is the notion that actually the way we think also affects how we feel. And it might sound intuitive, at the same time, it might sound not that intuitive, in the sense that with the pattern of our thoughts, I'm not talking about the content specifically, but how we think and what's happening mentally in our brain actually affects our well-being and our mental well-being. So my talk will seem initially a little academic and scientific, but I will make connections to especially stress, anxieties, but also maybe at the end talk a little bit about loneliness if I'll have time. So one statement that came from my lab that afterwards been supported extensively by research is that the way we feel in terms of mood, our mood, positive or negative mood, is actually linked with how associative is our mind, how broad we think versus how narrow. And I'm going to explain it because I know it's not too intuitive, this terminology. So if you take it a little further, also think about the brain, and this has been the biggest revolution in brain science for the last 20 years, thinking about the brain as a predictive organ. We would like to make predictions. Our brain always tries to minimize uncertainty for us. Okay, always tries to guess what is next, to predict what is next based on our memory and based on our experience. So people feel most comfortable in predictable environment. I'm not saying it's the most fun environment, but I'm just saying making us feel more comfortable. And we don't always seek comfort. So this is something to keep in mind. But you can already see the end, or maybe the end of the first part of my talk, how not being able to minimize uncertainty, not being able to be in a predictable environment can actually increase your stress and anxiety level. Okay, so these predictions are based on associations. And now what do I mean by associations? So imagine you have a representation in your brain of this coffee cup. Okay, so some neurons in your brain represent a coffee cup. And from our experience of everyday world, we know that such a coffee cup is connected also to related things, such as coffee beans, maybe a donut, maybe a coffee maker, sugar, etc. Each of these pictures, each of these representations in our brain is also associated with other things that are connected with it. And now you can see that actually our entire memory is a giant web of association, a giant web of things that are connected with each other. But the thing is that for a proper brain, for a proper operation of our brain, we don't want to activate this entire network every time you see a coffee cup, right? We don't care about this tent when you see a coffee cup. So what you want is that the right balance of how much to activate and how much to inhibit. So the brain works with this balancing act of not too many activations, but not too little. Just activate the information that's relevant for you now, so that you can predict. You see a coffee cup, you want to predict that there might be a donut around or a coffee maker, right? So associations is a storage mechanism, but also an activation mechanism that help us know what to expect, how to prepare, and to enhance predictability and thus decrease uncertainty in our environment. So we would like to use our memory, our experience, so that we can foresee what's coming with some resolution of accuracy. Okay, so this is the healthier brain, so to speak. We want some activation, some broad associative activation that a butterfly would lead to a fly, to an airplane, to a boat, and to a fish. But there are also cases of inability to generate these predictions, inability to think wide, inability to think in an associative manner in a more healthy way. And this happens when we cannot predict, when we cannot generate and lean on our associations, when we cannot predict, people ruminate. They're stuck on the same thought. You can imagine somebody stuck at home or somebody in a familiar environment that just over and over with the same thoughts. And this can elicit mood disorders that include anxiety, stress, depression. We study, especially in my lab, depression and anxiety to see how the way you think, how broad and how narrow is your thought, affect how well you feel in terms of mood, okay? And indeed, when people cannot predict, when they cannot foresee, when they are surprised, they seem as fearful as when they see something threatening. So you cannot distinguish a face expression of somebody who's fearful versus somebody who's deeply surprised, because we're basing our actions on this ability to predict. So again, mood is directly linked to how associative or uninhibited our mental process. And when we are associative, we feel better. Of course, to some extent, you don't want to be too associative. Then there are other types of psychiatric disorders, such as schizophrenia, for example. So there have been, and I won't get into the specifics of the data, and you can read about this if you want. You can email me afterwards or whatever, and you can read online. But there has been in the literature and in our own work in the lab, connections between positive mood and how associative people are. And you can see it. Associative also translates to other traits, such as creativity. So when people are in better mood, they're more creative, they're more curious. Okay, and I'll talk soon about the fact that all these personality traits or states of mind, as we call them, it's not really personality, they change with mood, for example. So happier people are, by and large, this is not a rule, but it's a trend, that happier people are more creative and more curious. And I won't get into the clinical aspects here, but there are also elements that when you are thinking broadly, when you are thinking associatively, actually you get more neurons. There is something called neurogenesis. New neurons grow in your brain even when you're adult, just from the fact that you're more associative and happier and do a bunch of things that I might elaborate on later on. And we have quite a few publications. This is just one that came from our group. We're showing that more associative, happier. Okay, so you think more broadly, you think in a more associative manner, you get, when we measure your mood, you're feeling better. Okay, so the way you think, how expansive is your thought, translates to how well you feel. And when we look at brains of individuals, in this case, actually, we took depressed individuals, and you look at the activations in their brain, you see that individuals with depression, negative mood, activate associations to a lesser extent, less associations. Their mind is less associative. Not only this, they even lose volume of cortical, of neuronal volume, right? So they have less brain structure if they're continuously not activating all these associations. So associative mind is a healthy mind in many respects. And this is kind of a collection of supportive evidence from different lines of studies, not only from our own lab, that show how sadness, depression, and other aspects of negative mood correlate and map very nicely with the network that we know in the brain is recruited when we think in a very associative manner. Okay. So what we do very often in the lab and outside, now we're also trying to address people, when they're in the public, is try to improve their associative thinking, thereby improving their mood and their maybe depression symptoms. But it's not only for depression. All of us, first of all, depression is very prevalent in the world, like at least 30% of the population experience depressive episodes. But beyond that, I think we can all agree that we can all feel better, right? We're never at the top of the world all the time, right? So we want to feel better, and these ideas of associative thinking, improving mood, actually apply to all of us. And this is just a quick demonstration in one study where we actually showed people just words, that the words either surrounded the same topic. This is like rumination, being stuck in the same topic. So it's associative, but very narrow, versus broad, progressive, associative, expansive kind of list of words, just reading these words. And people in this list, actually can see it, that expanded with their thoughts, improve their mood. Okay, so this is just, I don't want to get into the details. It doesn't need to be technical, just the bottom line that making people read words that expand associatively versus stay narrowly associative improves their mood significantly. Okay, so switching gears, this kind of correlation between how we think and how we feel added to our bigger framework of what we call overarching states of mind, where we talk about how the mind actually is controlled, not in a sinister way, but is maybe modulated by you can think about this giant web that kind of affects our entire biases and mental capacity. So I'll just be more specific now. Many aspects of our cognitive life, our mental life, are included in this diagram, and many of them are studied independently. And here I actually call for their unification. So we scientists study perception. How do we see the environment? See, hear, smell, right? How do we use our senses to understand our physical world, the physical world around us? So this is perception, and perception can lean more on the sensory information, but a lot of how we perceive the world around us actually stems from our predictions. We call it top-down influences. What we already know, what we already expect, affect how we perceive the world around us. So in spite of our subjective experience that what we see is what's out there, we also, as scientists and also philosophers and Buddhists and many other people, know that actually our perception of reality is distorted and is affected by what we already know, what we already expect, and what we already desire, what we already fear, right? So our internal representations affect how we see the information, even if it comes through veridical sensors, such as our senses. Our attention, do we look at the forest or do we look at the trees, right? So there's a scope of attention that can change from being very local, looking at like small features of our environment, versus do you look at the entire building, the entire street, or do you look at windows and handles and individual people there? So this is a matter of effect of state of mind. Do we think broadly or narrowly? That's what I was talking about before. Openness to experience, that's another thing that one has to take into account also in designing the urban environment and everything else. People can change, even the same individual, regardless of personality, can change in how much they're willing to sacrifice safety and certainty in order for them to explore. So they can be very exploratory on one end, right? They can really seek the new, the novel experiences, the thrill, the learning, the curiosity, or they can just resort to their familiar environment, comfortable environment, places that feel safer. There's no good or bad. There's the right state for the right situation. There are places where it's good for you to resort to the familiar, to the safe, and there are states where, like, you're traveling to a new city, you want to explore, you don't want to hide in your hotel room, right? So there's a range here of, and the same also about mood. And what we say here when we talk about state of mind is that this entire collection of big cognitive and affective constructs like perception, attention, thought, openness to experience, and affect, all of them are tied together under this structure that we call state of mind. And they can change. We can be more towards the exploratory, broad association of thinking globally, or we can slide towards the other side. Most of the time, we are all somewhere along this spectrum. It's very rare to be in one extreme, right? And lean only on our sensory information, or look only globally, or think only broadly, but rather we actually slide along this spectrum. So each dimension can change the others, context-based. Well, this effect, this state of mind is really driven by the situation. So you can be in a certain place. If it's an intimidating environment, it makes you go to this extreme of being very narrow. You want to lean on your existing knowledge. You think locally. You think narrowly.
Sorry, if you could wrap it up. I don't know if you're coming to the end or not. Sorry to disrupt.
You just took a minute. Okay, so let me just wrap up then, as I've been asked here. So I'll just say that these states of mind actually can affect how, when we take into account the state of mind of our inhabitants, of people in the streets, people in buildings, people in classrooms, people in shops, we need to think, we have to have in mind when designing these things, their state of mind. What is their state? Are they more exploratory around here? Do we expect them to be more exploitatory? Do we expect them to, this is a novel environment. So what comes with novelty, right? There's more uncertainty. How do we approach and how do we accommodate individuals that we know will be really anxious with all this novelty? This is only one example, okay? So how do we facilitate with state of mind in mind, creativity, mood, exploration, familiarity, certainty, curiosity, learning, safety, scope? All these big words actually are affected by your state, and your state is dynamic, and your state can be manipulated by your environment, by your peer, by your company, by the people around you. So this is something that has to be taken into account. So I'll just wrap up by saying that associations and predictions and inhibitions are central to our mental lives, and really they're the basis of all this. And they're compromised in mood disorders. So when you're less able to predict, less able to associate, actually, we see some toll, some costs in our mood and our state of mind and our well-being. It's possible to regain this by making people think more associatively. And I want to say that cities that stimulate appeals to me and appeals to one extreme of this spectrum. We don't always want to stimulate. As I said, there are some areas where we actually want to be more maybe calming and radiate some safety. And so think about designs that accommodate this state of mind to make people less anxious when we want them, or more thrill-seeking when they can. And I think this is it.
Thank you so much, Moshe. First of all, it's a fascinating model. And I think anyone who is at the intersection of design and science is looking for these models to understand how we can streamline all this knowledge. Something that came up in my mind is that, you mentioned the rumination that happens when we stay in, when we're stuck in an environment, when we're maybe disengaged from the environment. And I think that's something that many people are experiencing around the world now as we're stuck at home. In that sense, you talk about the city as that stimulates, and obviously cities do stimulate. Do you think there's an element of this period in history where people might be looking for some familiarity in order to connect to what they used to know because of this disconnection? And then what does that mean for the types of experience that we design for, given that most cities stimulate rather than create a sense of familiarity necessarily?
Right. Well, I look at this state of mind issue as an opportunity to minimize friction. And the friction I talk about is between the individual and their environment. And before this nice meeting, I wasn't thinking specifically about architecture, but just your environment, the people around you, the activities around you, etc. So when you think in terms of frictions, you want to match the environment and the individual to hopefully minimize this friction, okay? So if this individual is expected to be exploratory, now in a museum, you don't want to show them familiar things, right? Because then it will be boring. But when they go to the supermarket, you don't want to be creative and hide things from them and mix them in an unsensible manner, but rather make things familiar. So they go to a certain experience, they want to see what they expect to see. They go to other places, they want to be thrilled. They want to be excited. So it's true that cities and urban environment stimulates, but I don't think it stimulates in the right way, in the right places, but rather when they take the individuals that they try to stimulate, it becomes very clear when you want to stimulate and when you don't want to stimulate. So it's really a matter of, I don't want to say moderation, but rather taking into account both ends, the individual and the environment. For you guys, it's already been known that you want to look in the individual within their environment, but to kind of get into their mind, so to speak, and understand what do they expect from this environment, what will be best experience from them in this environment. And then you realize that you think about the spectrum that I showed, some environments would call for more exploitatory, some will be more exploratory. So yes.
Great. Thank you so much, Moshe. It's really fascinating. Thank you for the comments. I think many people can be inspired by your work in what I said, the translation of the science to design, because you constantly look for what's the relevance of these findings to real life environments and experiences. So thank you very much for that. We'll move on to our next speaker, Alexey Danilov, Director of Interdisciplinary Medicine Institute and Chief of Department of Neurology at Sechenov University. Alex, what happens in the brain when a person is stressed out? Tell us about the main symptoms, when you can understand that you're under stress, and what this might mean for the built environment.
Hello, Ida. Thank you for giving me the word. I just noticed I got a brain fitness puzzle. My backstage is upside down, so you have to guess.
No, it's not. It's actually right. I had the same issue. To us, it looks backwards. To everyone else, it's right. So you're good.
Okay. To train your brain again, I'll speak Russian now. Okay. Уважаемые коллеги.
Dear colleagues, well, really, we are talking about stress in the city, and neurobiologists have been studying the stress impact on psyche, on health, and you have a certain level of anxiety, and we have a greater level of psychiatry diseases, and we have the rise of schizophrenia. Well, one of the reasons is the urban design. It was shown that monotonous gray, repetitive environment increases the level of depression, stress, associative behavior, consumption of alcohol, and increase of deviant behavior. Other reasons include various social statuses when people were born in the city, or they came to live in the city from the countryside. Well, the idea is urban environment increase anxiety, and we see the activation of the important part of the brain of amygdala. And today, apart from the problems that used to exist in the urban environment, we are facing the COVID that added something else to this environment. But let me mention some positive effects. Well, first of all, there has never been such clean air in the cities, so there is a correlation between the purity of the air and the death rate because of COVID. Well, a lot of cities now meet the requirements of World Health Organization in connection with air pollution. Well, a lot of people died because of polluted air, and now we pay attention to this problem because of the positive effects of COVID, and we know that apart from biological impact, it also has other impacts. Many businesses are being closed, and people are not losing money, people are losing perspectives, the conviction in the future. There is more unpredictability, and it's a risk of key diseases. Now we can have some summaries of this year with the syndrome of online working remotely from home, and with more people consuming more alcohol and less physical activity, calories-rich food, people in masks, all these factors add stress. But if we look at the situation in a broader scope and how this problem is being coped with, that the disillusion is that the whole focus is on masks and gloves and isolation. Of course, they are important, but not the key aspects if you want to resist and solve the problem. Because we have not got rid of obesity, hypertension, diabetes. They are still in place. The virus has become the last straw on the camel's back, so to speak, and contributes to aggravation of stress, and we see the rise of death rate because of COVID and other diseases. Since we are talking more about COVID consequences, I will outline the problems. There are not only biological factors in connection with lockdown, psychological stress, psychosocial stress that result in depression, post-traumatic consequences, rise of suicide cases, the risk of Alzheimer disease. Looking at the previous pandemics, the situation is not over when the infection has gone. For 5, 10, or 20 years, there are different consequences, post-encephalic and others. 5 years, 10 years later, there are after effects. Even for those people who were not ill, but children and families of those who became broke, doctors who lost some of their relatives and friends. So these psychosocial factors may contribute to psychoneurological diseases. We are talking about brain, and as Woody Allen said, brain is my second favorite organ. But nevertheless, I would pay attention that it's not the brain is here the most important thing, but immune system is also here. They are acting together, and this coronavirus, together with stress, they support each other and contribute to diseases and development of different social and psychological aspects. When you look at TV and see coffins in ice stadiums instead of hockey matches, and instead of gay parades, you see a lot of cars with sprinklers to disinfect squares. And information every day as weather forecast about the number of dead and sick every day. And of course, it contributes to the number of new patients. But let's go to the best, to a better thing, how to get rid of it, how to resist it. But speaking broadly about different threats, because we have poverty, economical crisis, we'll have other threats in the future. The idea is to concentrate not only on negative pathological things, but how to reinforce our psychoneuroendocrinal system, how to mitigate the consequences, how to have the balance in the system. And here I want to use the Chinese experience when children starving came to their parents. The parents did not give them fish, but they gave them fishing rods. Of course, people can get money from government, food and gifts, but from the experience of different charity organizations and volunteer centers, such gifts have opposite effect. So the most important thing is to reinforce the resilience. And I want to the theory of salutogen of Antonovsky in 1967. It was formulated that the environment should be salutogenous when the environment reduces stress and you can overcome different factors provoking stress. And Alan Delaney spoke about creation of the environment that stimulates your recovery, improves your mood and productivity. This is what Mr. Moshe was speaking. When the environment is friendly, brand-friendly environment, this salutogen environment is about concentration not on pathogenesis, but on factors that improve your emotions and your life. And one of the proposals in our Institute of Interdisciplinary Medicine, my colleagues and I, where we have a special department of this salutogenous design, and we proposed 5 important factors. When we put emphasis on only one, we won't go far. Well, we heard a lot about loneliness today, and certain studies show that loneliness is correlated by the volume of gray matter brain, particularly for the elderly people, old people who are isolated. And on the other hand, there is a concept, a problem of loneliness in the crowd. When there are a lot of people and they communicate to each other, but this communication does not make them happy. Now we can have a very meaningful approach about such practices as meditation and mindful activities when you don't send a lot of SMS messages and phone calls. You can be lonely but feel well. This is what the new programs about improvement of psychological health must be aimed at. And this mindfulness improves our state. Well, there are special programs and products. For example, feedback, neurotraining. There's a special fMRI neuro training, and you see in this slide on the right a scheme when the anxiety is at a very low level. That's a very efficient way of improving psycho-neuroimmune state. But of course, to improve the situation, we are to use these programs. Called Alert from Canada came to the forum last year and was speaking about nature and environment positive impact on brain, and nicely built environment has a positive effect and ugly environment has negative effect. I would stress that beauty aesthetics also improves the functions of brain. Well, we had a special program in Moscow, Long Life. And this program was abolished, unfortunately. And to compare isolation during the pandemic and people go to dance parties in the parks and to compare the effect of the reduction of gray volume and other problems connected with isolation and compare with the situation when you got infected during a dance party in the park. Well, I think very careful communication, taking the precautions will give positive effect. This union with nature will change the percentage of endorphins. We improve our feeling, general state of mind, and our immunity becomes stronger. We are more sustainable and stronger, and our actions should start from ourselves. Yes, I'm going to finish soon. Well, just 1 minute. And starting from our apartments, and our institute invites dear colleagues to participate in this study of effects on the environment on health. We are designing new apartments with special systems of air purification and other gadgets, making the environment more attractive and nice to live in. And we invite you to participate in this project to study different effects of the environment on the psychological state and the brain. Well, and also, I draw your attention to a change of design of the cities after the pandemics. Thank you for listening.
Thank you very much, Alexei. Fascinating. I do have lots and lots of questions. I'm going to keep the question to the end if we have time, because I want to give enough time for the other speakers. But thank you again for the talk. We're going to head over to Robin Hewins. Robin, you're Director of Campaigns, Research and hold on, we just need to, if you unshare your screen, Alexei, please. Yes. So Robin, you're Director of Campaigns, Policy and Research in the Campaign to End Loneliness in the UK. You lead a team with a presence in all four UK countries, driving actions on loneliness through research, convening, and influencing. Tell us about your organization and your activities and what you think we can do to end loneliness in the city.
So yes, we were founded nearly 10 years ago as a way of trying to bring focus and attention onto the issue of loneliness. I think that at the time, it was very much seen as being an issue that was most about older people. And the research and evidence has focused on older people. But I think as we've gone through the last decade, we've seen that actually loneliness is an issue across the age spectrum. There are some risks that cluster in older age, particularly not kind of recent healthy retirees, but more if people become unwell, or if they're bereaved, or if they become disabled. That kind of some big risk factors for loneliness in later life. And then in younger life, there's some big transitions, moving for work or for education, or social groups that just change much more quickly when we're younger. And I think it's slightly speculative, but I think it feels like there's some things around resilience, that one of the pleasures of getting older is that you've seen there, you've done it before, and you can deal with things that might be more challenging when you're younger. So we have 3 key areas. We try to develop the evidence base. We work closely with academic researchers and try to bring that evidence to a wider groups. We work with the community of organisations who are interested in loneliness, which is a really broad community. It's a big area for charities and the voluntary sector, but we also work with a good deal with government and the public sector, and also with private companies as well. And finally, we try to make the case for action on this issue, which kind of goes into something that we were part of a broader movement in the UK that campaigned on this issue. and that helped to lead to a government loneliness strategy with a dedicated minister for loneliness. And I think that has been running for a couple of years now, and there's been a series of useful actions from central government, but in a way it's been particularly helpful as the pandemic has hit, because there has been a good understanding inside government already of the importance of social connections, and there's been dedicated funding and work to try to make sure that that loneliness is addressed through this pandemic. So I will move on. So I was asked to talk a bit about what we think can be practically done about loneliness. And I think that really there is no silver bullet. There's no one single solution for tackling loneliness. There's a whole kind of system that works best when it fits together. And so I'm going to talk briefly about just in the kind of broad chunks. So this is we call this the promising approaches framework. It reflects that as a relatively young issue, loneliness doesn't have some great, long, massive academic evidence base. A lot of this is about judgment and experience, as it is about having kind of perfectly done randomized controlled trials. But if we start with someone who's lonely or at risk of loneliness, on kind of my left-hand side of the screen, you can see that the first task is to find people. Loneliness isn't something. Loneliness is stigmatized. It isn't always immediately apparent if people are loneliness, and so having the kind of services and conversations to help reach people is important. And then I think because loneliness is not, because loneliness goes into our psychology, it makes us think more negatively about our social interactions. It makes people lose confidence, and it makes it harder. Loneliness actually can make it harder for people. Loneliness is about a lack of meaningful social contact. It actually makes it harder to originate them. And so it's really important that people are supported, often really quite actively, to kind of re-engage in social life. And then in order for them to do social things, people need infrastructure that can either support that engagement, or if it isn't there or is bad, it can actually get in the way. So I'm going to talk about gateway infrastructure in a little bit more depth in my next slide. But digital has obvious uses for people knowing about what's going on, keeping in touch with people. People need to get about. If there aren't buses, if you don't have access to a car, particularly in rural areas, that can be a real problem. And then the kind of direct things that you can do about it, that might be engaging in groups, it might be one-to-one. And as I was saying earlier, sometimes it's about helping people with their psychology. There's a whole load of other bits of this diagram at the bottom, but I'm going to skate over that so that I can keep to time and be good for Aisha's blood pressure. So finally, I just wanted to, given the focus of this conference, I wanted to talk a bit about where we see the role of the built environment. So it's something which, as I say, reflecting that this is a young issue, it's something that we've brought into the framework only this year. But, and I think we've already heard, I think at the kind of quite in-depth scientific level, about the way in which environment impacts on how we feel. And so some of this is about how we feel, and some of it is about some very concrete things. So housing can support people to get out and about, or it can discourage connection. For example, in terms of just the basic accessibility of whether someone can get down the steps to get out of their house, whether the lift in their apartment block is working. But it can also be about the slightly more intangible things, that there are spaces where you bump into people, spaces that you have a common areas in apartment blocks where people might bump into each other. We need public spaces that feel, as we've just been hearing, that feel safe, that people, one really important driver about loneliness is whether you feel safe and welcomed in your community. So if people, if they feel vulnerable to crime or to forms of discrimination or abuse, it's a really significant driver of loneliness. We need community spaces for the kind of voluntary groups in society that help to bring people together, but also there's a role in the kind of private sector for cafes, pubs and shops. People say that they really value them. And I think it's a real worry for me in this period about whether cafes and pubs might go out of business and not come back into business when they're needed again. We've done some really interesting work with older people talking about how much they value them as places to meet, as places to have things to talk about, and really as things which can make life worth living. So that's a brief tour, but I hope you found it interesting about where we're up to in the UK and some of the broader lessons of that.
Will be boring if people will drink beer at home.
Будет сложно.
We'll get more bees and in bad mood.
That's your question now, by
Would
the
it be
way.
boring?
No. Anyway, thank you very much for the talk. I have to say, as someone who comes and really believes in the power of the built environment to affect our health, we don't often see organizations looking at the built environment as a potent ingredient in their strategies. Usually it's a matter of services, and this is really great to see from your organization, the Campaign to End Loneliness. So thank you very much. We'll move on to Olga, who is going to give our last talk of this session. Olga Kitaina is speaking from the angle of psychology and how we connect with others, whether we can create the networks, whether they are digital, or what can we learn about connection through digital networks, and how that might impact real life feelings of community and sense of belonging. Welcome, Olga.
Спасибо большое. Всем здравствуйте.
Thank you very much. My name is Olga Kitaina. I'm a practitioner, a psychologist, and I'm also a founder of Alter, the network for finding experts. Yes, I will talk about loneliness from the psychological perspective. I will try not to repeat what my colleagues have already said, and we have talked today about loneliness, but this term is sometimes misunderstood, and I would like to say that being alone physically does not equal being lonely. And I've studied different statistics in Russia, and I've seen that in Russian media, they often talk about people who are not married. They say that they are lonely, but it is not really correct, because loneliness is an emotional state. It is our feeling of support from others, because a person, an individual, can live alone but not feel lonely. And also we have the term of social isolation. This is really the state when a person has no one to talk to or to ask for something. Why do we need loneliness? Why loneliness appeared? Well, loneliness is an evolutionary mechanism which allowed to our predecessors to survive. Only the ability of people being social animals and their cooperation with others in creating villages and human settlements allowed us to survive and to take over other animals, because we are not the strongest in the world in comparison to other animals. And also one of the punishments used earlier was isolation, and also a person could understand that his or her social network is under danger, and that's how the feeling of loneliness appeared. My colleagues have already talked about the fact why loneliness can be frightful and why so many scientific experts pay attention to loneliness, because this leads to the rise of stress. Well, as I've said, it is an evolutionary mechanism, but if we feel loneliness and stress too often, it will also increase the death rate, the alcohol dependence, and depression, suicide, or other cognitive changes, shifts in mind, and the way the individual acts. For example, a person may think that no one wants to communicate with him or her, and afterwards his or her sense of loneliness will increase even more. The sense of loneliness can decrease memory, and also there are some statistics which show that loneliness can be spread over. If one individual is feeling lonely, it means that people with whom he had a social interaction also maybe will feel lonely. Unfortunately, we have not a lot of data. There was only one survey made by Rosstat, and we tried to see how often people feel lonely. I've also looked up statistics for the UK, the US, and some European countries. I see that more and more people notice that they feel lonely, and also we see difference in income. Also, we see that with age, this feeling of loneliness is rising. And also women say that they are lonely more often than men. And my point is that maybe men are just less prepared to acknowledge it, because this feeling of loneliness is not really socially acceptable, and that's why for men to acknowledge their vulnerability, it is harder to do because of some gender stereotypes. I've already said that loneliness is a stigmatized feeling, and there are a lot of people who do not want to acknowledge that they are lonely. There are some stereotypes which say that only unfortunate people can be lonely, and it is also connected to the feeling of intimacy, togetherness, and I'm sure that everyone has at some point faced this feeling of loneliness. Even if you have a big family, you just understand that this is a signal that you need to work on something, and you need to work on it in a more detailed manner. Only if you feel lonely several times per week, for example, there are some factors which can cause loneliness. As a psychologist, I cannot not mention negative childhood experience. If, for example, a person had less support in his childhood, he also will see other people as a potential source of danger in his adult life. Also, there are other social factors. Bad self-rating, or some mental disorders or difficulties, depression or other diseases. For example, if physically it is difficult for an individual to come out from his or her flat, it also can contribute to the development of loneliness. Well, what is the link with the city? You know, the term loneliness in English appeared only when cities appeared in the 18th century. So that's why even in English language, the word loneliness did not exist. There was a word
Please wrap up. We need to wrap up the session. Thank you.
loneliness. So, wrapping up, I would like to say that the city environment now shows us that people are focused on their career, and our life-work balance is modified, and sometimes we make sacrifice of communication with the friends because we need to do something for work. Also, church is no more a place for communication for people. People marry less, and also we see such a factor as negative politeness. You know, we rarely say hello in lifts, for example, and sometimes we do not have real contact with other people in the streets, for example, and I'll wrap up now.
Okay. Thank you so much, Olga. All amazing insights. I think it's really interesting to look at the psychology of loneliness and connection here. And in the way that you're doing it, translating it into technology, but also how can we use it for the more hard things in our environment, like the built environment itself. So we're going to wrap up this session. Thank you so much, everyone. We have, as you can see, there's so much knowledge coming out of research that we need to translate and make healthier environments. Apologies for not being able to carry on more of the discussion. There's a plenary session opening now, and so I encourage all the attendees to go there as well, and also to contact the speakers. Working with these people, the researchers, the people in organizations, can be a great boost to your efforts. And the interdisciplinary nature of the way the built environment is being created is really the future. We're seeing the effects on it, on how cities are being used to increase population, well, to benefit population health. And if we don't think of it from all these directions and think holistically and interdisciplinary, we're not going to get as far as we'd like to. So I do encourage you to contact all the speakers as well. Thank you very, very much, all of you, and for attending and for listening, and have a great day. Enjoy the rest of the conference.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you, Itai.